Good afternoon. I'm very happy to see you all here. Today I will speak to you about my research on the history of the Soviet Union during the years that Joseph Stalin was the leading figure. I'd like to tell you when and why I became interested in Soviet history of the Stalin era. My first field of specialization is medieval studies. I was trained to do deeply historical research. For instance, to use primary sources in languages other than English, never to rely on received knowledge or received opinion, not to trust the opinions of recognized authorities, to check everything for myself. What interests me is the truth, both the truth itself and the search for the truth. I think this question, the truth, is very important. People often say that we can't know the truth. That's false. We can learn the truth about history, just as we can learn the truth about the natural world through the sciences of physics, chemistry, biology, zoology, and so on. History can and should be a science. Broadly speaking, the scientific method in all fields of inquiry is concerned with A, gathering evidence, how to do it, and then doing it, and B, interpreting that evidence, that is, how to draw correct conclusions from it. If you have ever studied the Sherlock Holmes stories by Arthur Conan Doyle, you have an idea of how a skilled detective works with evidence and deduction in order to solve murders and other crimes. The same kind of method can and must be adapted to discovering the truth about historical events and persons. The problem is this: we live in a world where the ruling class does not want us to discover the truth, because the truth shows, time and again, how dishonest and exploitative they are. This is what happened to Galileo, the famous Italian astronomer of the 17th century. Galileo bought a telescope from the Netherlands, where the science of optics and the grinding of lenses was most advanced. Then Galileo looked at the planet Jupiter. He saw that the moons of Jupiter rotated around the planet. Galileo realized that this was what the Polish astronomer Nicholas Copernicus had theorized but had not been able to prove, because the instrument, the telescope, did not exist in Copernicus's day. Galileo concluded that the Earth rotated around the sun, and not the sun around the Earth. To the powerful, the kings and princes, and leaders of both the Catholic and Protestant churches, this was heresy. They claimed that it contradicted the account of the creation of the world in the book of Genesis. But this was not their real concern, or at least not their only concern. What really worried the ruling classes of Galileo's day was the implications of the scientific method. For the scientific method can be learned by anyone. It takes the monopoly of knowledge, learning, wisdom, and the truth out of the hands of those in authority and into the hands of anybody who takes the trouble to learn it. Using the scientific method, no one has to accept the word of any authority as valid. Anyone can use the scientific method to test any truth claim, the statements of any authority, and if those statements of the authorities are false, can prove them false and discover what is true. So the scientific method, including the version of the scientific method used in the study of history, is a threat to those in power who want to impose their version of history on the rest of us. And it is a tool of liberation for the rest of us who want to learn the truth. As a graduate student from 1965 to 1969, I opposed the U.S. war in Vietnam. During one anti-war demonstration in New York City, I met a man who tried to convince me not to oppose the Vietnam War. He said, and it is quite true, that the Vietnamese war against American imperialism, and before that against French imperialism, was led by the Vietnamese Communist Party. The man who had founded the Vietnamese Communist Party in the 1920s, and who, at that time, was still leading it, was named Ho Chi Minh. Ho Chi Minh had been trained in Moscow under the direction of Joseph Stalin, and then he told me, quote, Stalin had killed millions of innocent people. 20 million, I think he said. I recognize that this specific argument is a form of the slippery slope argument. a logical fallacy. I did not stop opposing the American war in Vietnam. But I made up my mind that when I had the time, I would look carefully into this business. In the early 1970s, I read the first edition of Robert Conquest's book, The Great Terror, first published in 1968. I was shaken by what I read. Conquest's book is a long series of one horror story after another, crimes and massacres supposedly committed by Stalin and the Soviet communists during this time. The book is more than 700 pages long. It is horrifying. I could read the Russian language since I had already been studying Russian literature since high school. So I made a particularly careful study of Conquest's evidence and the way he used it. During the next several years, whenever I had the chance, I took the bus from East Orange or Irvington, New Jersey, where I lived at the time, to the New York Public Library. The New York Public Library is one of the great libraries of the world. It has almost every book or journal useful for historical research. And it has an excellent Slavic language collection. Russian is a Slavic language. The evidence for the fact claims that Conquest makes in his book is in his footnotes. I wrote down all of Conquest's footnotes, well over 1,000 of them, on 3x5 cards. Over a period of several years, I checked every single footnote in Conquest's 700-page book. What I discovered would not surprise me today, but it did surprise me then. Conquest was dishonest in his use of sources. His footnotes did not support his anti-Stalin conclusions. Basically, he used any source that was hostile to Stalin, regardless of whether it was reliable or not. Eventually, I decided to write something about the so-called terror. It was very hard to get this article published. The editor sent it to 3 reviewers. All of them said it was a good article. But the publisher who owned the journal rejected my article. He said it was not anti-Stalin, and so he would not publish it, regardless of the evidence and regardless of the editor's and the reviewer's recommendations. The editor had to threaten to resign before the publisher would agree to publish my article. When it was finally published, that issue of the journal is named Russian History, began with an introduction that had a brief summary of each of the articles in that issue, except for my article. My article was published there, but it was not mentioned at all in the introduction. Somebody was afraid of the truth in my article. I will begin by discussing my first book, whose title in English is Khrushchev Lied. It has already been published in Russian, Turkish, Galician, French, German, Spanish, Hindi, Bengali, Tamil, and Chinese translations. Translations into more languages are on the way. In this book, I studied Nikita Khrushchev's famous secret speech, which he gave before the 20th Congress of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union on February 25, 1956. This is the most influential speech of the 20th century. In terms of its political impact on the world, it is probably the most influential speech in human history. In this speech, Khrushchev accused former Soviet leader Joseph Stalin of terrible crimes. Stalin had died 3 years earlier, on March 5, 1953. Khrushchev's speech was only a secret for a short time. Soon it was printed so that it could be read out loud at many meetings of Communist Party members in the Soviet Union. On June 5, 1956, the New York Times published an English translation that it had obtained for the American State Department. As a direct result of Khrushchev's accusations against Stalin in this speech, within 2 years, almost 1/2 of the members of all the communist parties in the West had quit their parties. The world communist movement had received a blow from which it never recovered. In October 1961, at the 22nd Congress of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, Khrushchev and some of his top officials levied even more accusations of crimes against Stalin. After 1961, Khrushchev sponsored many books and articles by Soviet writers and historians. These works elaborated Khrushchev's accusations and made even more accusations against Stalin. These books and articles were eagerly collected by anti-communist writers in the West. The accusations in them became the basis of hundreds of books and thousands of articles about the horrors of Soviet communism during Stalin's time. These materials were published all over the world in dozens of languages and in millions of copies. Many of them were translated and smuggled into the Soviet Union and other socialist countries. These books and articles were the main sources for Conquest Book. Many of them are still cited, quoted, and footnoted by historians even today. Before 1956, the Trotskyist movement was very small and had little influence. Then Khrushchev's secret speech was published. Suddenly, Trotsky, who had spent his last decade of life accusing Stalin of large-scale crimes and falsifications, seemed like a prophet. Some communists quit their communist parties, walked across the street, and joined the Trotskyist movement. One of the leading Trotskyist writers today, David North, credits the sudden growth and influence of the Trotskyist movement to Khrushchev's speech. Trotskyist writers have been quoting it as fact ever since. Trotskyist parties, activists, and writers continue to rely on the anti-Stalin lies published during Khrushchev's and Gorbachev's time. In 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev became the leader of the Soviet Communist Party. From 1987 until the end of the Soviet Union in 1991, Gorbachev conducted a campaign of anti-Stalin propaganda on a scale even larger than Khrushchev's similar campaign 25 years earlier. In 2005, I had for several years been studying documents that had been released from former Soviet archives after the end of the Soviet Union. During these studies, I had found evidence that Khrushchev had lied in a few of the accusations he had made in the secret speech. Eventually, I identified 61 accusations that Khrushchev made in that speech against Stalin or Lavrentiy Beria. I began to look for evidence about these accusations. I myself was shocked at the results of my research. I was able to prove that 60 of the 61 accusations in Khrushchev's secret speech were false. In the 61st case, I could not find enough evidence to determine whether Khrushchev's accusation was true or false. The implications of this discovery are hard to overestimate. First, the world communist movement had been fatally wounded by a speech that virtually everyone had believed to be true, but was in fact all falsehoods, most of them provable, deliberate lies. Second, since Khrushchev had done nothing but tell lies in the secret speech, did that not imply that Khrushchev had been unable to discover any genuine crimes by Stalin? Third, what other lies had Khrushchev and his men told about the Stalin period? Fourth, Gorbachev and his men had possessed all the evidence that I had found, plus much, much more. They had to know that Khrushchev had lied, but they had said nothing. And what about their own accusations against Stalin? Fifth, during the 1930s, Leon Trotsky had also accused Stalin of great crimes. The fact that Khrushchev lied suggested that perhaps Trotsky had been lying too. My book, Khrushchev Lied, was published in Russian in Moscow in 2007. It sold very well, over 13,000 copies of a very heavily documented scholarly book. But when it was published in English in February 2011, it went around the world. The implications of the fact that Khrushchev's famous secret speech is false from beginning to end are still being realized. Since 2011, I have written and published 8 more books in English and a number of articles. In all these works, I examine accusations against Stalin of crimes. So far, in every single case, I have found these accusations to be false. So far, I have not been able to verify a single accusation of crime against Joseph Stalin. My second book examines the murder of Sergei Kirov, murdered in Communist Party headquarters in Leningrad on December 1st, 1934. Just like Trotsky, Khrushchev wished to prove that Stalin had had Kirov killed. This was part of his plan to declare all the defendants at the Moscow trials innocent. Eventually, Khrushchev's top-level commission found that Stalin did not kill Kirov. But they could not or did not want to contradict Khrushchev's basic historical paradigm. So they concluded that Leonid Nikolaev, who shot Kirov and was caught on the spot, was a lone gunman. Stalin, therefore, must have had everyone else framed. They declared all the Moscow trials to be frame-ups and all the defendants innocent. This became the basic story for the Western anti-communists, too. It still is. In the 1980s, Gorbachev's men also tried to prove that Stalin had Kirov murdered, but they were unable to do so. Eventually, they too fell back on the Khrushchev-era findings that Nikolaev was a lone gunman and Stalin had framed everybody like the evil guy they wanted him to be. In September 2011, Matthew Leno, a professor of Russian history at the University of Rochester, published an 800-page book in Yale University Press's Annals of Communism series titled The Kirov Murder and Soviet History. Leno had spent 10 years writing this book. He intends it to be the last word on the subject. In it, Leno claims that he has proven the Khrushchev-Gorbachev hypothesis that Nikolaev was a lone gunman and that Stalin framed everybody else. But Leno is wrong. I prove that in great detail in my book, The Murder of Sergei Kirov. We have a huge amount of evidence now that proves that the men convicted and executed, along with Nikolaev, in December 1934, were in fact guilty. More than that, we have a huge amount of evidence that the accused in the Moscow trials, all three of them, were also guilty. Guilty not just of what they confessed to, but also guilty of crimes to which they did not confess, but which have come to light since then. Leno does not even mention a lot of this evidence. This is called bias of omission. It is a powerful tool of lying and distorting the truth. Leno has deliberately deceived his readers. Undoubtedly, he did so because the evidence contradicts his own preconceived idea that Nikolaev was a lone gunman. The point is, this has to be his conclusion because it is the only conclusion acceptable to mainstream anti-communist historiography. Because Leno, like all anti-communist researchers, hides from their readers the evidence that contradicts their conclusions, you can only learn of this evidence if you spend a lot of time, effort, and money identifying, locating, obtaining, and studying the evidence. My next book, Blood Lies, was published in August 2014. In it, I examined the dozens of accusations against Stalin and other communists that are contained in Timothy Snyder's book, Bloodlands, Europe Between Hitler and Stalin, 2010. In Bloodlands, Snyder, a professor of history at Yale University, compares Stalin to Hitler, the Soviet Union to Nazi Germany, and communism to Nazism. Bloodlands has won many awards. It has been translated and published in 26 languages. I decided to study this book for two main reasons. First, I knew from my previous research that at least a few of Snyder's accusations against Stalin and the Soviet Union were false. So I figured that some more accusations of crimes by Stalin and the Soviet Union might also turn out to be false. Second, I believed that I would finally learn about some real crimes that Stalin actually committed. I reasoned that Snyder would certainly have found at least a few genuine crimes of Stalin. Snyder had the library and archival resources of all the Eastern European countries at his command. In addition, he had the help of all the resources of the anti-communist Polish, Ukrainian, and German researchers whom he knows personally and whose work he relies on. I was wrong. I spent 2.5 years checking all the evidence, every single citation in Snyder's book. Most of his citations are in the Polish and Ukrainian languages. So I had to study Polish and Ukrainian until I had learned these languages well enough to read them. I already knew Russian, French, and German. My research revealed that Snyder had lied about every accusation against Stalin, the Soviet Union, and pro-Soviet communists. Not a single accusation is supported by the evidence he cites, or by any other evidence. The implications of this conclusion are important. Neither Snyder nor any of the dedicated anti-communist scholars whose works he cites could find a single genuine crime by Stalin. This implies that there were no such crimes. For if there were any such crimes, surely this team of dedicated, highly motivated anti-communist researchers, with all the money, libraries, and archives at their disposal, surely they would have discovered at least one crime, if there were any. Here are a few examples of the alleged crimes of Stalin and the Soviet Union that I have discovered to be false. The supposed Soviet invasion of Poland of September 17, 1939, and the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. At a conference in 2008, an anti-communist liberal academic learned that I considered myself to be a Marxist and loudly challenged me. What about the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact? I realized that I did not know very much about it, so I determined to spend some serious time researching it from primary sources in the original languages. I learned a lot. One thing I learned is that the Soviet Union did not invade Poland in September 1939, although virtually every history book today says that it did. I also learned that, of all the Allied countries, only the Soviet Union acted properly in a principled manner during the pre-war period. Leon Trotsky's lies and conspiracy with the Germans and Japanese. I have now written and published 2 books on what Leon Trotsky was doing during the 1930s. Here, too, the history that we have been taught and that almost everybody has accepted turns out to be false. In 2010, I published a long article in which I collected and then examined all the evidence I could find at the time of Trotsky's collaboration with Germany and Japan. I concluded that, on the evidence, any objective researcher would conclude that Trotsky had collaborated with these fascist powers. With the evidence we have today, no other conclusion can account for this evidence. In 2017, I expanded this article, adding much more evidence into my book titled Leon Trotsky's Collaboration with Germany and Japan, Trotsky's Conspiracies of the 1930s, Volume 2. Amalgam is the word Trotsky used for what he said were Stalin's falsifications. I've discovered that it was Trotsky, not Stalin, who was lying. My book, Trotsky's Amalgams, was published in 2015. Terror and Yezhov versus Stalin. In 1968, British writer Robert Conquest published his book, The Great Terror, Stalin's Purge of the 30s. Conquest relied heavily on Khrushchev-era books and articles, which he cited without source criticism, as though the claims made in them were unproblematically accurate. Conquest's book proved to be of enormous value as anti-communist propaganda. Scholars of Soviet history began to employ the term the Great Terror as a designation for this period of Soviet history. The goal of my 2017 book, Yezhov versus Stalin, The Truth About Mass Repressions and the So-Called Great Terror in the Soviet Union, is to identify the causes of and properly locate the responsibility for this mass repression. Historians of the Soviet Union have proposed several different explanations. My research concludes that all of them are fundamentally wrong. These historians have in fact not been trying to discover the causes of the mass repressions. Instead, they are groping for an explanation that fits the dominant historical framework or paradigm for this period. I call this the anti-Stalin paradigm. The Katan Massacre. In 2007, an anti-communist Russian challenged me about the Katan Massacre. This is the claim that the Soviets shot between 14,800 and 22,000 Polish prisoners of war in 1940. The Soviets always denied this, until Mikhail Gorbachev and Boris Yeltsin, speaking for the Soviet and then the Russian governments, finally said that yes, Stalin was guilty of this crime too. Between 2006 and 2013, I studied the evidence about the Katan massacre. I created a web page on which I have put a great deal of the evidence about this fascinating and mysterious event. In early 2013, I learned about a discovery made by a team of Polish and Ukrainian archaeologists at a mass murder site in Ukraine. I realized that what they discovered there proves that the official version of the Katan massacre cannot possibly be true. I spent several months researching and writing an article about this and about the cover-up of these discoveries. My article was published in 2013. In July of this year, 2018, my book-length study of the Katan massacre was published. My research concludes that the Germans, not the Soviets, are guilty of these mass murders. This is the same conclusion as is drawn by a few Russian researchers, but I have not followed the method that they use. Instead, I've used the method that a detective would employ, a detective who did not care who was guilty, but whose aim was solely to find out the truth and report that truth, and let the chips fall where they may. By that time, I had been studying Katan for years. Once I began to systematically sort, categorize, and study this evidence, I realized that there are only a few bits of evidence that cannot possibly have been fabricated or falsified in order to bias the case in favor of one or the other version. So, in this study, I concentrate on these few bits of what I call the unimpeachable evidence, meaning evidence that it is impossible to discredit as evidence. This unimpeachable evidence is of two kinds. One, evidence that goes against the bias of those who produce the evidence. For example, the Germans admitted in 1943 that only German shell casings were found together with the bodies of the murdered Polish officers. The Germans would never have deliberately planted those German shell casings. Therefore, this evidence could not have been faked. Two, evidence whose significance the party which discovered it failed to understand and so never used. Katan is, quote, the best documented crime of Stalin, end quote. If Katan is removed as a crime of Stalin, what crimes will remain to blame Stalin with? If it becomes widely known that Katan was fraudulently blamed on Stalin, people will begin to wonder, what else is Stalin falsely accused of? And then, what will be left to uphold the Stalin boogeyman, the main form of anti-communism in the world today? Soviet guilt in the Katan massacres is very dear to the hearts of anti-communists. Here are my experiences so far. 1. The president of the Polish Institute of National Remembrance sent a letter of protest about me to the president and trustees of my university. 2. I was invited to record a podcast in a New Books on Russian and Soviet Histories series. But when the professor in charge of all these podcasts heard my podcast, he refused to publish it. 10 days ago, I was kicked off the H. Poland list, a mailing list of researchers of which I've been a member for more than 6 years. The list manager also refused to publish the notice about my Katan book in his monthly New Books note. I am presently protesting his actions, since, in fact, he does not have the right to do this. Stephen Kotkin, Stalin, Waiting for Hitler, 1929 to 1941. In October 2017, Princeton professor Stephen Kotkin published the second volume of his planned 3-volume biography of Joseph Stalin. It is 1,150 pages long, including 909 pages of text, 160 pages of triple-columned footnotes in tiny type, and 47 pages of bibliography, also in tiny triple-columned type. Obviously, very few people are going to read this monstrous book. Probably none of Kotkin's readers, except for me, will check Kotkin's footnotes to see what he cites to support his fanatically anti-Stalin and anti-communist fact claims. My book will have 12 chapters, plus introduction and conclusion. 10 chapters are on the major events of the 1930s, about which all kinds of lies are normally spread. I will also have 2 chapters of miscellaneous falsehoods, which are very numerous. In each case, I have checked Kotkin's footnotes, and I prove that he has no evidence to support his accusations against Stalin. In fact, in some cases, the works he cites in his footnotes contradict his fact claims. Kotkin also engages in bias by omission. He omits important documents from the document collections that he himself frequently uses when those documents contradict the anti-Stalin paradigm. Bias by omission is one of the most effective means of falsification because only another scholar who is very familiar with the primary source evidence on Soviet history will know what Kotkin is leaving out. Whenever I find bias by omission, I cite the materials that Kotkin leaves out and that disprove his claims. I have discovered that very few people, no matter how motivated, will read books that are more than about 300 pages long. All my early books are between 400 and 550 pages in length. So I have made 2 decisions. First, beginning with Yezhov versus Stalin in 2016, I keep all my books under 300 pages in length, and as much under 300 pages as I can. Second, I am planning to update, divide up, and republish a few of my earlier works as much shorter books. I have divided Trotsky's Amalgams, a book of 536 pages, into 3 shorter books. 2 of them have already been published, The Moscow Trials as Evidence and The Fraud of the Dewey Commission. The third will be Trotsky's Lies of the 1930s. In conclusion, what have I learned? I have not found a single crime by Stalin. Every story about Stalin's crimes is false. Anti-communist scholars are not trying to discover the truth. Rather, they are writing anti-communist propaganda disguised as research. I call this propaganda with footnotes. I discovered that, far from being some kind of horrible criminal regime, the Soviet Union of the Stalin period was principled and moral. As far as I have been able to determine by the evidence, Stalin and the Soviet Communist Party of his day tried very hard, in fact, heroically, to build a socialist society of justice for working people and to develop that society towards communism. The Soviet Union did not build a communist society. Instead, socialism led back to exploitative capitalism. We must study the history of the Soviet Union to discover what errors they made, so we do not make those same errors. We also need to study Soviet history to discover what the Bolsheviks did that was correct, so we can learn from these things too and imitate them. Thank you for listening. I hope you will ask me tough questions, and I promise to do my best to answer them.
All right, everybody who has questions for Professor Furr, first I just want to thank you. That was a great speech.
Thank you very much.
So everybody who has questions, please post them in the chat, and I will go ahead and, I don't know, should I unmute them or should I just read it for them? I don't know.
I think you should probably read it for them.
Fair enough.
Can I ask a question first?
Yeah, go ahead.
I actually have several questions, but Professor Furr, can you hear me all right?
Yes, very well, very well.
All right, excellent. Regarding Trotsky's fascist collaboration, could you talk about what kind of evidence we have for that outside the Soviet archives themselves?
Well, there isn't much outside the Soviet archives. That's a question that arises very frequently. There's, in my view, not only Trotskyist, but anti-communist scholarship in general uses Soviet evidence when that evidence supports or seems to support the viewpoint that the Trotskyists or the anti-communists support, but reject Soviet evidence when that evidence appears to negate or contradict or disprove the positions that the Trotskyists or anti-communists support. Now, this is routinely done, for example, about the Moscow trials. It's one thing to say, and I'll say it now, that this is a subjective and therefore an invalid way of using evidence. It's called cherry picking. You pick only that evidence that tends to support the views that you would like to see supported, and you reject everything else. But I thought that was not sufficient. So I wrote a book called The Moscow Trials as Evidence. It is actually the first 260 pages or so of my book, Trotsky's Amalgams. And in the Moscow Trials as Evidence, I try to verify or check as many statements, fact claims made during the Moscow trials as I could. Now, not only from former Soviet documents from former Soviet archives, but also outside the Soviet Union. And what I found was that I could check out virtually everything that I looked for. That is to say, all of those, whenever we try to check or verify a statement made in the Moscow trials by the prosecution or by the defendants, we can, whenever we can check that against other evidence, it turns out that the Moscow trials testimony is truthful. So therefore, I think that the position, which may be implied in your question, possibly, that unless we can find non-Soviet evidence that Trotsky collaborated with the Germans and Japanese, then Trotsky didn't collaborate with the Germans and Japanese. I don't think that's a valid statement, but a valid conclusion. But it is true that we at least need to check the sources of the Soviet evidence against one another and see where it leads. There are a few non-Soviet sources that I do cite, that I can use. One is an important one, is the statements by General Genrikh Lyushkov, who was an NKVD general who defected to the Japanese in June 1938. Another are the reports from Zborovsky, who was an NKVD spy who managed to become Leon Sedov's most trusted confidant and aide. Leon Sedov was Leon Trotsky's son and basically his main political aide. So those are we do have some evidence. We also have indirect evidence that, for example, implicates Marshal Tukhachevsky, and that is to say, non-Soviet evidence implicating Marshal Tukhachevsky, and Marshal Tukhachevsky himself implicates Trotsky. But what we don't have is evidence from, let's say, Japanese or German archives that say, hey, we're collaborating with Trotsky, isn't that great? We don't have that kind of thing. But if you read my book, you'll see we have a lot of evidence that that is not clearly not created simply to implicate Trotsky. A lot of evidence is a sort of offhand remarks made by some of the defendants and so forth. But that's the situation. I realize that there's a great deal of in Soviet history, especially among Trotskyists and anti-communists. And it would be natural that Trotskyists and anti-communists would simply deny any Soviet evidence that tends to prove Trotsky or guilty or Stalin innocent. But then they turn right around and use lots of Soviet evidence and try to twist it into showing how Trotsky was good and the anti-communists were correct. Vadim Rogovin wrote this, who was a Trotskyist historian who died some years ago, Russian Trotskyist historian, wrote a multi-volume history of the Stalin years in Russian. And he cites hundreds and hundreds of documents, sometimes dishonestly, but often badly, so that the rejecting Soviet evidence when it contradicts your own preconceived ideas is simply methodologically in error, methodologically dishonest. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, I don't want to take too much time from the other people, but what I find interesting is that I believe in your work about Trotsky's fascist collaboration, you mentioned how, or maybe it was in some other book, I don't remember, but there is a historian named Karsten, I think, who found some documents implicating Tukhachevsky in the German archives, and I think those were only discovered like in the 70s or something. So it really makes you think.
Yes.
Since Nazi Germany fell decades earlier, who still kept all this evidence secret?
Yeah, well, it's even better than that. There's a document. There's a document.
Could you repeat that? You cut out.
Certainly. Okay, I'm sorry. I'm going to, as soon as I can, going to publish a document from the Austrian archives. From the Czech archives. Czechoslovakia was negotiating with Hitler's Germany in late 36 and early 1937 to try to come to some understanding so that Hitler wouldn't seize Czechoslovakia, which of course he eventually did. And the Czech negotiator, the Czech ambassador, sent a note to President Beneš of Czechoslovakia, it's a private note, saying that his German counterpart had told him, this was in January 1937, that Hitler was no longer interested in any kind of deal with Czechoslovakia because he expected a change of power within the Soviet Union, which would put pro-German forces into power there. And therefore, of course, he wouldn't need an agreement with Czechoslovakia. So this document has actually never been published, although it's been referred to one or two places. So I'm going to publish it in both Czech and in, before too long. It's a good example. Now you might say, what's this? Well, Czechoslovakia was taken over by Nazi Germany completely in March 1939. So this is a document that was created before that. It's a non-German document, but it records this discussion between a Czech diplomat and a German negotiator. Interestingly, over 20 years ago, more like 25 years ago now, almost 30 years ago, I was in touch by mail with that same German negotiator about his negotiations, and he never mentioned this document. He still kept it secret. But in the meanwhile, it has been mentioned, and I managed to obtain a copy from the Czech National Archives. So yeah, there's probably a lot of stuff out there that that it would be good to have. My question is how a lot of it may have been destroyed. I have one maybe further example, if you're interested. The New York Times in, I believe, June 1945 said that, oh God. All right, can you still hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. We can hear you.
Oh, you can? Okay, because out. Anyway, the reported that Unberg, who was the head of intelligence, had testified that the Germans were guilty at Katan. But nothing else was ever heard of this, and of course that testimony has never surfaced. There's a book on Schellenberg by a European scholar who says that, well, Schellenberg was captured at such and such a date, but we don't have any interrogations of him until sometime later, and it's hard to believe that they didn't interrogate him in that time. So I have reason to believe that evidence has been destroyed or is still being suppressed as well. So I don't really expect that we're going to get German or Japanese evidence, direct German or Japanese evidence of Trotsky's collaboration with them. It may never have been written down, or if it has been written down, it may very well have been destroyed. That's why I started out by talking about the need to use Soviet evidence, which is the evidence we have, carefully and check it one piece against another and so forth and so on, but not to simply reject it. Because in fact, no one does that. Even the Trots and the anti-communists use Soviet evidence when they think it's in their interest to do so. They only doubt it. They only doubt Soviet evidence when it seems to contradict their own preconceived ideas. And of course, there's nothing scientific about that. Anybody there?
Yes.
All right. Thank you. Polinkash, if you want to read the questions.
Yeah. I'm going to read the first question, which is I don't know what this guy's name is, but someone asks, how do you think revisionism came about in the USSR?
Well, this is okay. Let me just start out with a disclaimer. This isn't my field of expertise, right? People don't contact me and say, "Oh, Grover, you have such great theoretical insight. Tell me what you think." I do history, and history can't directly answer questions like that. I can contribute, perhaps, no doubt, to answering those questions, but history doesn't answer theoretical questions directly. That having been said, it seems to me that what happened in the Soviet Union has happened generally in the case of the socialist revolutions of the 20th century. I think there's a similarity among them all. And the similarity is that they had a concept of socialism that was a sort of mixture of communist ideals and capitalist methods. That is to say, they had a definition of socialism which had been dominant in the Second International, which of course the Bolsheviks belonged to. There was no single, definition of socialism on paper, but in the Second International really sort of understood socialism as capitalism with lots of benefits and safeguards for the working class until the workers could seize power, either peacefully, which many of the Second International parties believed, or by revolution, which a few of the Socialist Internationalist parties believed, including the Bolsheviks. But they had, broadly speaking, similar notions of what constituted socialism. And it seems to me that that definition of socialism was lacking. It retained too many elements of capitalism. And I think you have to have some sort of concept like that in order to explain the quantity leads to quality changes that took place in the Soviet Union, other socialist countries. I would argue that took place in China as well, much later on. Some sort of forces were at work even during the best periods that developed within existing socialism and contributed it to reversing it. For example, Khrushchev came from somewhere. Khrushchev's supporters came from somewhere. These people didn't just decide on their lies and their pro-capitalist so-called reforms overnight. So my feeling is that we need to study the socialist revolutions and societies of the 20th century in order to isolate those aspects of socialism that in fact contributed to the reversal of socialism. One example, and this is probably not the kind of thing you're looking for. One example, the Soviets had terrible trouble with their intellectuals. They privileged intellectuals. They privileged writers. They privileged not only engineers, and people who were involved in actual construction of, scientific and factories and production and so forth. They privileged intellectuals in all fields, and with some exceptions, those intellectuals still remained hostile to Soviet socialism. They thought that things were not good enough for them, that they should have more liberation, more freedom to do what they wanted, that they looked longingly at Western Europe and the United States as places where intellectuals were supposedly got more respect. They were never won over. By the time you get Gorbachev, Gorbachev and the attacks on Stalin that Gorbachev was leading, it's clear that there were, among Soviet intellectuals, there were a large number of devoted and bitter anti-communists who, of course, had jobs and who paid lip service to socialism and to the Communist Party and to the ideals of communism. But clearly, once 1991 came around, suddenly there was this huge cohort of dedicated anti-communist scholars who just started to pour slime not only over Stalin, but over the whole idea of socialism and public ownership, to say nothing of communism, just as bitterly and as devotedly as the anti-communists in the West. Those people, too, were cultivated somehow or other within the Soviet Union. So I'm not an expert on China. My impression is that there was a similar development in China. And so I think that we have to have a very serious, objective look at the notion of what socialism was considered to be in the socialist movements of the 20th century, including the Soviet Union.
All right, thank you. I have my own question as well. How involved are you in Marxist theory and as a Marxist in general?
How involved?
Yeah, theoretically, like how much have you read regarding Marxism? Are you a very dedicated Marxist? Is my question.
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm dedicated. I'm not saying I'm particularly, but sure, I've read. I've read and studied the Marxist classics for many, many years. I maybe I didn't explain very well. I really wanted to get on to Soviet studies, but it was the being involved in the anti-Vietnam movement that got me involved in Marxism. I didn't understand why the United States was involved in the war in Vietnam. And after a couple of years of being involved in the anti-war movement, so maybe around 1967 or something like that, somebody, some kind soul, whom I don't remember, that, you know, this is imperialism. The United States is there because of imperialism. And I said, oh, well, how does that work? And started to explain it to me. And then eventually I joined a Marxist study group. You know, there were plenty of them in those days. And away we went. But so my interest in Marxism, and then my commitment to Marxism goes back to those days, goes back to the Vietnam War era.
All right, that's great. Garlic, you wanted to read your own question, right? Okay, I'm going to give you the opportunity to do that then. All right, go ahead and ask.
Bella.
1 second. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So, thank you again for your lecture. And my question is, there is a paper that's basically where Stalin says that he or Central Committee allows physical influence on interrogated people, and it was signed by Stalin and other top party members. I posted the picture of this paper. I wanted to know what your opinion on this.
Well, I don't know if that's a picture of the. I actually discussed that in some detail in Khrushchev Lied, which is my first book. So I don't have much to add to the discussion. But if you study that document, now I'm not saying the document is false, although Arch Getty, which is a name you may recognize, did say that document was, or came very close to saying that document was false in an article that he published 15, 16, 17 years ago. I'm not saying it's false, but if you read my account in Khrushchev Lied, you'll see that it's somewhat complicated. The genuineness of this particular document, I think, is very much in doubt. That doesn't mean, I'm not saying that there was, by Stalin or the Central Committee or the Secretariat or somebody, I'm not saying there was no statement saying that you can use means of physical pressure, I think is the term, against hardened, devoted enemies of the Soviet regime who refused to divulge their information. There may well have been such a document. I don't think it's this document. For the reasons that I set forth in Khrushchev Lied. And it would be somewhat lengthy here for me to try to recall all of that argument here, but I would say look into it there. And as long as we're on the subject, oh, by the way, just if you take one good solid look at that document, you take a look at it, right? It says in the middle of the second page that it was typed in 1956. Now, I don't know. It just take a look at my discussion in Khrushchev Lied. I think that specific document doubtful authenticity. But again, I'm not saying that there might not have been such a resolution or such a statement at some point somewhere. And Archgetty said that he saw such a document, but it was dated later in the year 1956. I'm sorry, it was dated later in the year 1939. Could be. I don't know. I mean, Getty said it. I wrote him some years ago about this idea of that. He said, no, this document, they weren't letting me make copies of anything in the archives, and I couldn't make a copy of it. And I don't have a copy of it. But I assume that I think he's telling the truth. Resolution of that dated later. So I think that this particular document, the one that you're showing here, and I also have put it online, by the way, it's on my webpage, is of dubious authenticity. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
All right. Next question is by Grant M. And he asked if you would put Trotskyists on the same level or almost on the same level as anti-communists.
Well, the effect is anti. But I know some Trotskyists. So here's my take on Trotsky. Here's what I think. Hope that this answers your question. Yes, in effect, Trotskyists promote anti-communism. Now, I mentioned this somewhere in that book that I wrote. Trotsky didn't attack the idea of communism. Trotsky, in his own way, upheld the idea of communism. And Trotskyists today, at least the ones that I'm familiar with, in their own way, uphold the idea of communism in some fashion or other. So they're not anti-communist, which Stephen Kotkin, the professional anti-communists, are, overt anti-communists are. They're not anti-communists in that sense. They are anti-communists in two interesting ways. First of all, they partake in the cult of Trotsky. They have an uncritical adulation for Trotsky and his works, and they believe everything that Trotsky wrote. Now, this is not compatible with Marxism. Marx's favorite slogan, which he wrote down in, I think, 1865, was doubt everything. You can't be a Marxist. You can't really be a Marxist and be a Trotskyist. Or let me put it this way. To the extent that one is a Trotskyist, one is not a Marxist. You can't have this kind of cult of individualism, cult of personality, uncritical attitude towards Trotsky or anyone else. The second reason is that they spread Trotsky's statements, Trotsky's anti-Stalin statements, as though they, without questioning them, without investigating, without double checking them in the way that I double check all of this material, all of this research that I do, all these fact claims and so on. In my book Trotsky's Amalgam, which I admit is a pretty long book, but in the central section, the part about Trotsky's lies, I write 3 or 4 which I take a number of Trotsky statements that he published in the during the 1930s in various venues, including the Bulletin of the Opposition, which is his major journal, and check them. I picked out statements that could be verified, could be checked up on, proven true or false. And I found out that he lied over and over and over again. I have this little book now, which is a selection from Trotsky's amalgams. It's very short, called the Fraud of the Dewey Commission, where I bring research to bear upon the 2 volumes of the Dewey Commission. Number 1, the hearings, and number 2, the conclusions, to prove that the Dewey Commission is was a fraud from the beginning. But members of the Dewey Commission, who declared Trotsky to be not guilty, even the members of the could certainly not have come to that conclusion if Trotsky had told them the truth. Well, now we know that Trotsky told the truth. And it isn't just Grover Furr who says this, because, why would Trotsky? Pierre Brouet, who was the most famous and celebrated Trotskyist historian in the world, because in the 19th, he showed, mainly from his studies of the Trotsky archives at Harvard and also at the Hoover Institution in Stanford, California, Pierre Brouet documented a number of lies that Trotsky. So what happens is that the Trotskyists simply ignore this stuff. Now, Brouet published it, and he remained a staunch anti-Stalinist and Trotskyist till his dying day. Brouet never drew the conclusions that flow from this. I do that in my book, Trotsky's Amalgams, and of course I made some discoveries of some other lies by Trotsky as well. But the Trotskyists never even paid Pierre Brouet's work. And why is that? Presumably because they just don't want to. That proves Trotsky's state undermines his authority. It certainly disproves the Dewey Commission, and so they ignore this stuff. In fact, they ignore anything that contradicts their anti-Stalin and anti-Soviet conclusions. So in that respect, it is anti-communism, and it's similar, more similar than different to the overtly pro-capitalist anti-communism, like Timothy Snyder, Stephen Katan, or Robert Conquest, who unknowingly falsify their evidence. Does that answer your question?
I assume so. Thank you.
Could we could maybe try a couple things to make the audio quality better?
Sure.
Who knows? Like, if we is manual input sensitivity better than automatic? If we manually set the input sensitivity to max, is that better than automatic? Oh, it's the same.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure it's the same.
Somebody gave me some suggestions, but I don't remember them anymore. If we hold on, I think it was Molotov. I will check. Yes, manual voice detection and put the mic sensitivity to max. I don't know, is that too difficult to do? Maybe it is.
I think yeah, I did reduce the bit rate a little bit, slightly, very slightly.
Does it sound good on your end?
Yeah, it sounds basically perfect on my end. There is a little bit of, there are a few cuts here and there, but it's for the most part it's good. So
pretty good.
Okay, that's good.
Pretty good.
Yeah. All right. So next question. I'm going to I might skip a few questions just because I don't want to take too much of Professor Furr's time. So. What is your interpretation on the events of the legal annexation of the Baltic states in the 40s?
Okay. You hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, good. All right. So before I undertook this job of writing this book on Volume 2 of Stephen Katan's biography of Stalin, which I've been involved in for the last 12 months, really. The book was published in October 2017. Of course, first I had to read it, which is a big job. But at any rate, before that came out, so back in 2000, I was researching on the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. I did a lot of research. I wrote a draft, but I need to do more. I'll come back to it sometime. I'm saying that because I was in the process of studying the annexation of the Baltic states at the time. There's a pretty good article by Jeffrey Roberts on this some years ago. But in general, all that much in English. But let me just say very briefly what I can recall from that period. In Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, communist, come on. Just a second, I'm timing out.
It's all right. Take your time.
Is where I don't remember in which two countries the labor movement itself was essentially out, even the non-communist labor movement. Now, what the Soviets wanted, so these were very right-wing and extremely pro-German. They were involved in negotiations with the German and talks with the Germans. Of course, they all proclaimed that they wanted to be considered neutral, but that just wasn't going to happen. They were not going to be neutral. Nobody was going to consider them neutral. Certainly the Germans weren't going to regard their neutrality. So it was clear, and in some cases this was even said. In fact, Katan even says it somewhere in that monstrous book, that these countries would prefer, the leaders of these countries said that they would prefer to remain neutral, but if push came to shove, they would certainly side with Germany, siding with the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union needed allies, and it had absolutely no allies. So they developed this idea, I'm sure you're familiar with it, of popular front governments. Now, they had a popular front government in France for a relatively short period of time. They had a popular front government in the Spanish Republic for some time. The Spanish Republic was destroyed. The popular front government in France collapsed. But that's really what they wanted. Governments that would be friendly to the Soviet Union. They approached Estonian, Latvian, and Lithuanian governments, and they said, listen, we demand that you be friendly to the Soviet government. Okay? We cannot having governments on that close to us. The Germans, of course, Hitler had said, okay, they're in the Soviet sphere of influence. So the Soviets forced the ruling classes of these countries, essentially, to do a number of things. First of all, to permit Soviet military bases to sign mutual defense treaties. Now, don't forget, he's had no intention at all fighting alongside the Soviet Union on the side of against the Germans, but they did sign the treaties because they felt they had no choice. I think we were right. And then they wanted popular front governments, and that proved impossible. The country that I remember the most clearly, Estonia, of which, of course, is the most. Estonian border was 100 miles from Leningrad, something perfect place for a jumping off point to an attack on Leningrad, and it just like with Finland. So the Soviets said that they wanted a pro-German government. Now, the Communist Party had been suppressed. The labor movement had been suppressed. There simply weren't any. There were no social democrats. There were no left liberal politicians. They had not been permitted. These were very. What happened in Estonia? The Estonian Communist Party, of course, came out. They were very active. they were leading force among the working. They didn't want a pro-Soviet government. They wanted amalgamation with the Soviet. So the way that I remember the research that I did, the Soviets were reluctant to go along with this, but they felt that they had the only alternative, that there was nobody around to form a popular front government. So they had this election, and by an
sorry, Professor Furr, you're cutting out a little bit
it was
right now.
published in this.
Just wait a second and then continue.
Sorry, there's an interesting book.
Professor Furr, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yeah, sorry, it's just cutting out a little bit right now. Could you continue from? Could you continue
Shall
from?
we call it? Well, I can.
Yeah. Could you continue from the election? That's I believe that's the last words that we heard.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Okay. There's a book by a contemporary Estonian scholar who is this issue pretty well. I don't read Estonian, of course, but it's translated into Russian. So this viewpoint, the one that I've just, is of course rejected today's communist Estonian government. I'm sure it's rejected by all anti-communists. But that seems to be the case. And the Soviets published collections of documents at that time, in English as well, of course in Russian, but also in English, which are not hard to obtain. And that seems to be the situation. So that's what I can tell you about the, you say the annexation. Okay, the elections which were arranged for the in the Baltic states, in which those who voted to join the Soviet Union. In these elections, of course, you know, this is the proletariat we're talking about. They didn't let the bourgeoisie. They didn't let those who were fervent anti-communists vote. So, you know, but that's the situation. The Soviet Union was simply not willing to hold the concept of the independence of the Baltic states higher than its need to keep the Baltic states either to the Soviet Union. And the governments at that time were simply not going to remain even neutral, even in a popular front kind of government. They were all itching to ally with Germany, whom they saw as their defenders against the Soviet Union. The same kind of thing could be said about Poland. So the same kind of thing could be. So the Soviet Union was in a position where it had to take the steps that it needed to take in order to keep armies as far, or the Finnish army, as far away as possible. And had it not done so, taken over, amalgamated, let's say, Estonia, just as it not pushed the border with Finland back as a result of the Russo-Finnish War, Leningrad might very well have fallen. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, Leningrad probably would have fallen. It almost fell as it was. And we know from Hitler's Ost general plan East that Hitler's plan was to destroy Leningrad, to raze it to the ground, and to simply shoot any of its inhabitants who during this process. So the casualties would have been much, much worse. Also, Leningrad, of course, was a major industrial center for the Soviet Union. So it would have been a catastrophe, not only for the Soviet Union, that the Soviets understood, for the Allies in general, it would have been a Allies, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, which pushed the border of the Soviet Union hundreds of kilometers to the west, was very important for Soviet survival, too. I mean, the Nazis came within 100 miles or so of Moscow. And that was because, at the 1939 Soviet border, at the pre-1939 Soviet border, they would have had several hundred kilometers less distance to travel. They might very well have seized Moscow. That would not have been good. So I think that the Soviet Union did what they needed to do.
Okay, we're going to take, I guess, I don't know, how much more time do you have, Professor Furr?
It says 12:38 here on this thing, this computer. I mean, I can continue. You've gone to a lot of trouble and to organize all of this, and I don't want to shortchange you, but
can I ask?
Feel free.
Sorry, for how long?
Whenever you decide enough, feel free to let me know, and we can end it. But I'm prepared.
All right. Well, I don't want to take too much of your time. So I think I'm just going to take 3 more very interesting questions.
If I can, I don't know what type of microphone you have, Professor Furr, but I think if you hold the microphone closer, that also can help, because that's just how Discord works.
I do believe he's using his iPad, so...
Your voices are cutting.
Oh, okay. I think your internet might be cutting out right now. Just give it a minute. Real quick, I just want to ask everyone, how do you guys think the talk was? All right, can you hear us, Professor Furr? Professor Furr?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes. Okay, wonderful. Yeah, so I just asked everyone how they felt about the talk, and everybody seems to say that it was a very great talk. So I just want to thank you again for that. But let's continue with the questions. So I'm going to. I'm sorry. So the can you hear me?
I can hear you, yes.
Okay. So the next question was asked by our good comrade Vyacheslav Molotov. His question was, one second, let me find it. How would you explain the contrast between independence referendums in various republics in late 1991 and the all-union referendum in March 1991? The all-union referendum had a large-scale majority in favor of the union, while the independence referendums had a majority supporting independence.
Another question. I have not studied the Gorbachev era of the raising, but I haven't looked carefully in it. My field is really the Stalin period, and so I don't want to spread the ignorance too much. I don't really have any kind of independent interpretation.
All right.
All of that.
Then we'll move on.
I don't know history. Yeah, Stalin period. I know that better.
All right. Well, then we'll move on to Heitor's questions. I'll just let you ask him yourself, Heitor. So I'll unmute you. Hold on. Okay. There you go. Go ahead, Heitor.
Okay. So my question is: have you known Ludo Martens, and have you ever read his book about the fall of the Soviet Union and of the Eastern Bloc? And if so, what are your thoughts on his analysis of the fall of the Union? Can you hear me?
I can't. Up to. Yep. Sorry.
Wait, did you hear my question? Sorry. I can't hear anything.
Heitor, give it a moment.
I'm gonna ask my question again if any of you haven't heard it. So, Professor, my question is: did you ever knew Ludo Martens, and have you ever read his book about the fall of the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc? And if so, what is your opinion on his analysis on that book, which is?
If you're talking, do you mean another view of?
I'm talking about I'm talking about the dude that made another view on Stalin.
Okay, that's a couple of things. First of all, that book followed the Soviet Union. That book was first published in the late 1980s. That's number one.
Well,
number Ludo Martin's, heart was in the right place. Let's put it that way. He was deeply suspicious, as many others, of Khrushchev's, the Khrushchev statements, claims about Stalin's crimes and so forth. He was deeply suspicious of that. He wasn't the only one. That was I would say, a very influential book in its day, in let's say the 1990s. Did not read Russian. He, used what sources he could find in Western European languages. So, in its day, I certainly read it a number of times back in the 1990s. once I became aware that documents from former Soviet archives were beginning to be published, and that I could access them, I could get copies of them, study them. It soon became clear to me that Ludo Martin's book was out of date. So that's what I would say about it today. It's seriously, seriously out of date. Not only because Martins didn't know Russian, but even if he had known Russian at that time, the documents from the former Soviet are available. So it's seriously out. But in his day, I certainly remember reading that book and making copies, Xeroxing copies. I remember Xeroxing, having photocopies, 5 or 6 copies made for my daughter, who gave them to her friends. This is back in the 1990s. It certainly wasn't at that time. Soviet aid for the Spanish Civil War. Somebody's asking this here. The Serbian partisan. Shall I say something about that?
Yeah, go ahead if you wish, yes.
Sure. That'll be a chapter in my next book. I've also excerpted it. As an article, and I'm going to try to get it published separately. Although it's not going to be easy, given the bias of even the leftist journals out there. There are very, very few even leftist journals that will publish articles that could be classified as pro-Stalin. 2 journals that I have published in a few years, Socialism and Science and Society, both have, as well as others, both have dedicated Trotskyists on their editorial, and they have fought like crazy to keep my articles out of those journals. I'm fortunate that in a couple of cases I was able to get some articles published in those journals, but that is very difficult. There really are no academic journals, even leftist journals. I'm not talking about journals affiliated with political parties here, with communist or socialist political parties. That's a different matter. But in terms of academic journals, there really are no academic journals radically to what people regard as a pro-Stalin viewpoint. But I have excerpted that stuff. Briefly, the version of the Soviet role, the NKVD's role in the Spanish Civil War is very, very serious. There are a number of questions that come up. There was a very good book published some years ago by a Russian scholar about gold. There's a lot of good information on the NK and the POOM, the anti-Soviet, anti-Stalin party that included many Trotskyists but was not officially a Trotskyist party. There's a lot of information on these matters now, and I have put together as a chapter in a forthcoming book, and I am planning on trying to get published as an article. I did notice, although it's back here, did notice Soviet. There's some very good scholars on the Spanish Civil War who acknowledged that the Soviets gave a lot of aid. The NKVD, people who were Trotskyist allies, Trotskyist who were ferociously anti-Soviet. And I do cover this in my article, and you know, it would take me a long time to go through the details, but yes, the NKVD role and the Soviet-Spanish Civil War has been viciously slandered and lied about ever since George Orwell, and before George, and certainly by most anti-communist scholars. Definitely. Here's a picture of something. What does it say?
The next question that I did want to get to is Karitanov asked, one moment, let me find it. I saved it from earlier. One moment. Just give me a second. Where is this? Okay. No, that's not there. All right, there we go. Karitanov asks, what are your thoughts on the system of Yugoslavia and the Tito-Stalin split, and was it justified?
Oh, you know, I get asked that a lot, and I have to say that I have been so busy studying the 1930s that I have not yet gotten very far into the 1940s. And so I cannot, one thing I know, that if you haven't studied the primary sources in any subject, whether it's Soviet history or anything else, if you haven't gone through the process of collecting, of identifying, collecting, studying primary sources, your opinion isn't worth anything. That's what from my study of Soviet history in the 1930s. And so I don't really trust anything I've read by any authors who have not done that. I have to the Tito-Stalin split, and therefore I would prefer to say I don't know. And just parenthetically, I think the words "I don't know" are very important words for responsible Marxist scholars to utter. We should not pretend to know more than we do, and to give conclusions simply out of ideology, the logic, theology, or whatever, out of our bias, our predilections, out of our preconceived ideas. I don't know about the Tito-Stalin, and I haven't researched it. I would like to leave it at that.
Okay. Also, a Vietnamese comrade asked a question about the supposed rape of Berlin. Hold on, let me get the actual question. There's a lot of questions here, so let me just scroll up. All right, what about the rape of Berlin?
Is not my strong point either. I'm not aware of. What are you talking about?
Vietnamese comrade asks, what about the rape of Berlin, which people think the Red Army raped those innocent people under the command of Stalin?
Oh, you're talking about the German women?
Well, more so, the notion that the Red Army invaded Berlin and then, raped innocent people, essentially razing the cities, et cetera, et cetera.
Sure. Yeah, well, I put together some of that. I mean, I've looked into it to a certain extent. Let me say this. Rape was a problem in all of the Allied armies. And a couple of years ago, a book appeared in German. I have it in my office the other day. I'm not sitting in my office right now, called Als die Soldaten kamen, which means when the soldiers came. It's a book about Allied rapes in general. I don't doubt, in fact, I think it's accepted, that there were incidents of rape by Red Army soldiers of women, for example. There were incidents of rape by soldiers of the other Allied countries. It's just that those incidents of rape have not been written up very much until perhaps very recently. I quote an article in my book, Blood Lies, a Times article that talked about this subject. And since then, this German book has come out. So, easy to get objective information about this, but I would say that rape was a problem all of the Allied countries and all of the Allied armies. And in order to compare them information, say, well, it was a bigger problem for the Soviets than Americans, or a problem, in order to do that kind of thing, you would need to have a lot more information than I think has been gathered. The Soviet Union the Red Army was basically occupying countries which had been to the Soviet Union, had participated, either were very hostile to the Soviet Union, even Poland, for example, where the Polish Home Army was extremely hostile to the Soviet Union, even collaborated with some instances, or countries which, like Hungary and Romania and Germany, of course, countries which had aided the Nazis in carrying out these in the Soviet Union. So I would suspect that there was much more hostility among Red Army soldiers in the territory, for the populations in the territory that they occupied, than there would have been for the Allied soldiers. The Allied soldiers were mainly conquered Belgium, France, Italy, countries where the fascists were either totally unwelcome, or in the case of Italy, very largely unwelcome. So the Allies received a much warmer welcome from the populations in the countries that they conquered, and the Red Army did from the populations in the country occupied. So I would suspect, that there might have been a degree of rape, if however that's to be measured, in the than in the West. But frankly, we don't have the facts. We don't have the data. I'm not sure the data was kept, but we don't have it, and we know that rape was a serious problem in the Allied. That's it.
Okay. I guess this will be the last question. I'm sorry for everybody who didn't get their questions asked. But some communists from other countries were killed in the Yezhovskina, such as Bela Kun and various people from the Finnish Communist Party. Were they innocent?
Yes.
Were they purged, or what happened? Do we know?
Okay. Well, back about 20. At the University, a book called Imminent. It was an incredibly good book in its day, and it's still a pretty good book on the Comintern. It, of course, doesn't have all of the information that I'd like to have, but it has a fair amount of information, including a lot of documents, a lot of statements, confessions, discussions in the Comintern that. In which it is alleged that Bela Kun was involved in the right Trotskyist conspiracy, the right-Trotskyist conspiracy against the Soviet Union. Okay, that's that book 20 years ago. About the same era, there was a book published by Osip Pятницky's son, Vladimir Pyatnitsky. Pyatnitsky, as you may recall, was commentary 5 when he was replaced by Georgy Dimitrov. And Pyatnitsky was arrested in 1907 and ultimately executed in 1939 or 8. Vladimir, you understand me?
Yes.
You hear me? Okay, Vladimir Pyatnitsky, Osip Pyatnitsky's son, was a World War II, remained in the Soviet Union, was very actively, but always was convinced that his father grew to hate Stalin, was one of the founders of the Leningrad Memorial Society, which of course continues. No more of that name, but the Memorial Society is a major anti-communist organization in Russia. He was one of the founders of that society. He published a book about his father in the late 90s in Russia. Vladimir Pyatnitsky, an elderly man, he had been allowed to see parts, he said, of his father's investigation file, because up at that time, after the fall of the Soviet Union, but still within the first 10 or 15 years, the only people who could gain access to the investigation file of those who had, tried and executed under or imprisoned during the Yezhovshchina were members of the direct family, members of the immediate family. So he was able to get some, at least, of his father's investigation file. There's a fair amount of evidence in there that indicts not only his father, but also others, including Bela Kun. Now, it's an interesting experience for me to read that book some years ago, because Vladimir Pyatnitsky is convinced that his father was it. He starts off from that premise. But the documents that he cites point in the opposite direction. So Vladimir Pyatnitsky takes the position that, well, his father was tortured to say all these things. Vladimir Pyatnitsky also got to see some parts of the investigation files of other people, those parts that had been included in Osip Pyatnitsky's file because these people had named or accused Osip Pyatnitsky. And so therefore some of their stuff got into his file. He'd seen some of that stuff too. So there was a lot of evidence against Bela Kun. Now, fast forward to the last couple of years. During the last couple of years, my wonderful Moscow colleague, Vladimir Babov, and a colleague of his have been in the FSB archive, which is the former NKVD archive, and have gotten a number of investigation files from the 1930s of people like that, including Pyatnitsky's investigation files. Now, we don't know if they got everything. They think they got everything. We can't absolutely guarantee it. They sent a lot of me. If you read these and you have on the surface, it seems very clear that these people were guilty. There's no evidence that it was tortured out of them. There's no evidence that this is framed. I can't promise you that they weren't tortured. I can't promise you that they weren't framed. There's just no evidence that they were. We have their investigation file. And then it becomes important to compare investigation files from different people and also with other information we have from Soviet archives. It looks to me like case suspected to 20 years is very likely that there was a conspiracy Comintern, people like Bellakun. Now, Bitsky and Bellakun have been rehabilitated. That's what makes it possible to get these files today. To my knowledge, very few people are interested. My colleague Vladimir goes there with his friend to get this material. And he says, basically, nobody's asking. Nobody's asking for Isaac Babel's investigation file. Isaac Babel was a famous executor. He was named by Yezhov. Nobody's asking for Vladislav Meyerhold's investigation file. He was a theater director, a very famous guy who was also named as a spy by Yezhov, who was executed in 1940. These people it's assumed, widely assumed that all these people were, but now that it is possible to get a lot of the evidence against them, whatever it's worth, but we can get it, seems that practically nobody is interested. My colleague Vladimir is interested, but he and I are in certain figures, and there are a great many historical figures whose files exist there. So I would suspect that Bellakun's file may very well be available. But in order to get it, you have to go to the FSB archive in Moscow. You have to somehow or other set up, as Vladimir has, a good working relationship there. And you have to request it. And then at this point, you have to copy out the documents by hand. Vladimir has not yet informed me that whether he's been able to take, like say, a digital camera and take pictures of pages in the file. As far as I know, he still has to roll out, which is a step, copying it all out with a pencil on another piece of paper. But these documents are, in some sense, publicly available. So, provided that people take advantage of this material, we're in a position now to know an awful lot than we knew before. I have some of this material, not about Bellakun, but about others. In my book, Yezhov versus Stalin, we have Stanislav Redin. He was an NKVD, a high-ranking NKVD man, one of Yezhov's right-hand man, was executed around the same time that Yezhov was. We have his investigation file. It's because evidently Khrushchev demanded that he be rehabilitated back in the 1950s. Under Gorbachev, his case was reconsidered, and the Soviet courts decided that he should not have been rehabilitated. But statute of limitations had expired, and it was too late to rehabilitate him. And at this point, the FSB archive has decided that they are only going to release for study files from people who have been rehabilitated. But surely that includes Bellakun. It doesn't include people, unfortunately, like Yezhov. We would love to have his investigation file. However, through hook or by crook, a number of confessions and interrogations of Yezhov have been published here and there. I put them together on my webpage back in 2010. I draw heavily upon them in my book, Yezhov versus Stalin, which is published a couple of years ago. So the answer is that if there were interest in looking more deeply into the question of the so-called Great Terror, the Yezhovshchina, including executions, trials of people in the Comintern, I think the documentary situation is much, much better today than it ever has been before. But it seems that at this point, nobody is looking. Okay?
All right. So one last thing. Could you tell everybody where we could get your books?
Well, they're all listed on my, which I'm sure if you just Google Grover Furr homepage, I'm sure it'll pop up. There's no need for me to give you this complicated URL. They're all listed there. You can look on Amazon. I believe they're all for sale on Amazon.
Some people are saying that some of your books are only available in the U.S. on Amazon.
Okay. They should contact me. You should give them my email, and I can direct them either to my publishers. I've got a couple of different publishers. Either my publishers' web page, because I know he sends stuff abroad, or there's one more thing you should know. This is good for the future. Erythros Press is changing his printer from being whoever his printer in Ohio is to Amazon.com, because Amazon.com has a self-publishing, has a essentially a printing and publishing facility. And that they offer their books for sale. They offer the books for sale in Europe, so that you can actually buy some of my books already in Europe, and you don't have to pay the tremendous mailing costs from the United States to Europe. You have to pay the costs from let's say England to other parts of Europe, but that's much, much cheaper. So look on my homepage, and if that's not enough, send me an email, and I can help you further once you've emailed. There is a problem, which is I don't have, the worldwide publishers. So yes, it is expensive to mail to other parts of the world from the United States, but there's deal with that, at least in some cases. So if you can't find them on Amazon or on my homepage, then email me and something.
All right. Well.
Okay.
Well, thank you very much for coming on to our community and doing this talk. If everybody could thank Grover Furr in the chat.